Hi. This is Mono from NORAND, and it may look like yet another analog mono synth with slides and accents, which is why I started out this video with a 303 style pattern, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Let's though get this out of our system first. More of this jam at the end of this video. But if we set aside the drum machine and distortion for a bit, all these sounds are generated just by NORAND MONO, which has one of the most innovative modulation capabilities and user interfaces I've ever seen in a hardware synth. It has an analog signal path, but it's digitally controlled in a very special way with 20 modulators and around 16 envelopes, almost one per knob. It can also store presets and has electron-style parameter and sound locks, and yet it manages to pull all those things off without a screen. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at it, including detailed pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure. NORAND sent this over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with an overview. NORAND MONO, as its name implies, is a single voice mono synth with two analog oscillators and a mixer that can drive them into an analog filter, which then goes into an analog VCA. Now, the oscillators and filter have a few analog tricks up their sleeve, but I think what makes this really stand out is the sheer number of modulators and envelopes, and just as important, the interface you use to get at them, which, rather than dive through menus, is all managed using the LEDs embedded in each of the knobs. So just for example, as I change different presets, you can see the knobs reflect not only the positions of the parameters, but also whether they're being modulated. For example, here, you can see a pretty rapid modulation on this oscillator, but if I reduce that rate, you can see that reflected in the LED on the knob as well. If all these blinking LEDs are too much of a Christmas tree for you, you can disable that with a triple click on the function button, in which case only the highlighted parameter lights up. Now, once you select a parameter, then you can edit its assigned modulators, both the X mod, which is kind of like an LFO that can also go into audio rates, and its X envelope, both dedicated to each knob. So these are the values for the filter cutoff, X mod, and these are the values for oscillator 2 frequency. The fact that you could see the values on the knobs themselves, I think is just amazing. And like I mentioned earlier, you can also see whether a parameter is being modulated if you triple click the function button. So for example, if I was to apply an LFO, slow LFO to the cutoff here, like you saw earlier, you would see that reflected in the LED. So let's just take a look at this in action. I'll load up an empty project. Let's go for this one. This is the init preset. The init preset, by the way, has a smidge of filter envelope, and the filter is closed about halfway. Anyway, so let's say that I wanted to apply an LFO to the filter cutoff. I would just make sure that it's the highlighted parameter and then simply assign a mod depth and rate. So in this mode, X mod is acting as an LFO. It can also run at audio rates. And in the LFO mode, obviously has a broad range of speeds. And I could go ahead and change the wave shape using the wave button. Let's go for a sawtooth, and I want it to go in the opposite direction, so a negative mod depth will take care of that. So that's a nice modulation for the filter. I could now go ahead and apply a completely different modulation, say to oscillator 2 frequency. So let's say I would want to modulate this. I've selected it, and then I would just select a mod depth and rate. which could be a completely different shape and completely different rate than the filter modulation. So the two X mods are completely unrelated. For example, I could take the Oscillator 2 frequency modulator to audio rates, while the filter X mod is still at the slow LFO rate. The only thing you need to be aware of is that you're modulating whatever knob is highlighted. So oscillator frequency has these modulation parameters, and filter cutoff has these modulation parameters and shape. So you have an X mod for almost every one of the knobs on the panel, and you have an X envelope for, again, almost all the knobs except the ADSR envelope for the VCA and the filter. Anyway, these capabilities, both in terms of number of modulators and the LED feedback, that's something that to my knowledge you only see in software synths, and one of the biggest sources of frustration that I have with hardware synths that have presets is that once you load up a preset, the knobs no longer give you any idea as to parameter values. This solves that problem. On with the overview, another feature that makes NORAND Mono stand out is the support for what they call here mod notes. This is similar to sound locks on Electron devices or AFX mode on the Novation Base Station 2. Let's start with an init preset and take a listen to what this would look like. So to enter mod note mode, you press these two keys, and now you can start assigning presets to any one of the keys on the bottom, the white, so to speak, keys, with 5 banks of these 8 keys. So let's say I take this, that's my init preset, or I can change it to whatever I wanted. So let's say this sound, and then put something completely different here. Maybe let's take oscillator 2 and pitch it here. So that's mod note 2, and back to here. That's my original sound. And I can keep on doing this. Again, assign different values, add FM, whatever. Change any modulation. So let's maybe go ahead and modulate the filter here at audio rates. Let's go with this. So now I have 3 completely different presets that are immediately available, and I could sequence these on the sequencer as well. NORAND Mono, by the way, isn't paraphonic, at least not as of this firmware, but I could say take this paraphonic preset, copy that, and then say paste it into here, then change the interval. And now I have 2 different chords, which I could sequence any way I wanted, or just play live. On with the overview. Speaking of sequencing, NORAND Mono has a step sequencer with up to 64 steps in 4 banks of 16 steps each. You can chain up to 8 of these sequences to create longer patterns. We'll talk about the oscillators and the filters in a bit. Aside from the X mod and X envelope that's assignable to each of the knobs, you have an ADSR envelope that is applied both to the VCA and to the filter if you want through the envelope mount knob. NORAND Mono is pretty much knob per function with some shift functions labeled in red, which are accessible using the function button. There's no screen, and you can pretty much do without the manual once you understand what's going on, except for some parameter settings where you'll see a few options light up and you'll need to look that up in the manual. So for example, if you wanted to change the play modes, there are 3 modes where patterns lead into each other either immediately or wait for a pattern to end. That's something you'll need to either learn by heart or look up in the manual. In terms of the overall build and connectivity, the knobs feel very solid. They have this angle to them, which takes a little bit of getting used to. Not a big deal. They're okay, and like I said, they're solid with barely any wobble. The switches and buttons feel excellent and responsive. The panel, the top of the panel, is metal. The body is plastic. My unit has some wobble which can be fixed by applying pressure to a corner over the side of a table. In terms of connectivity, you have a single mono 1/4 inch output, 2 clock inputs, and 4 CV outputs, with CV2 being configurable to one of several sources like clock, filter frequency, or the main envelope, MIDI in, out, and through, USB for firmware updates, and for MIDI but not power or audio. It's powered by a power supply which is included in the box. Notably missing on the I/O side, I think, is an external input option if you'd like to process audio through the filter. So that's the overview. Let's dive in a little bit deeper and take a look at the oscillators. I'll get out of mod note mode, open up an init preset. Like I mentioned, an init preset has the filter closed, in a bit of modulation. So let's set things to a wide open filter. The oscillators are fed into a mixer, by the way. I'll make sure that it's at noon because it does start to saturate and clip beyond that. Anyway, the two oscillators are more or less identical in terms of basic controls. You've got a broad frequency range for both. You don't have a separate knob for octaves and semitones, so it may be a little hard to find the exact note, but this LED, which hopefully you see on camera, helps you find the right note, right semitone. Wave shapes morph from sine to, with a few harmonics, but it's a sine, to triangle, to square, and a sawtooth. There's no pulse width modulation, though you can of course modulate this knob with either the X mod or the envelope. There's also a fine detune. And yeah, oscillator 2 is more or less identical. Multiple wave shapes. The oscillators are good and beefy, I think. If I had to look for a flaw in them, then there's a little bit of wobble with oscillator 2. I don't think it's that noticeable, you tell me. And the reason I think is because oscillator 2 has a few cross mod options that oscillator 1 doesn't have. So it's got both FM by oscillator 1 and oscillator sync to oscillator 1. Oscillator sync is fairly straightforward. This knob, by the way, is quantized to semitones, so you'll hear a better oscillator sync sound if we modulate it, which yeah is pretty easy. And this is all done in reference to oscillator 1, of course. So that's oscillator sync, and the FM is the good kind, which is through zero linear FM. So let's maybe start with a basic shape and start FMing oscillator 2. The nice thing about through zero FM is that it plays pretty well up and down the keyboard. If you maintain a good ratio between the oscillators, it does that even better. So let's say take this to a fifth and take oscillator 1 to this, so you get both nice sounds and very playable. And where it gets interesting is if you play with different modulator shapes, depths, and carrier shapes. All of these modulatable as destinations completely separately. By the way, you can activate both sync and FM, which opens up all kinds of interesting forms of craziness. So that's pretty much the oscillators. There's no noise generator, though you can sort of fake it with rapid modulation to shape and frequency. And there is a, when you go into audio rates, there's a noise modulator on the X mod modulator. Okay, let's move on to the filter. I will calm things down again with a init preset, and let's not modulate this to begin with. So the filter is a state variable filter with an 18 dB per octave slope, so pretty sharp slope. This is low pass mode, but it goes from band pass to low pass and through to high pass, also with a pretty sharp slope. And all these three modes are resonant. Notice that the filter does hop through semitones, so if you want a smooth motion, at least currently in the current firmware, then you'll need to modulate it. So these little skips are intentional. You could obviously modulate. And it's smooth when it's modulated. If we saturate it, it sounds pretty nice as well. The filter does self-oscillate, so if I turn down both oscillators and crank up resonance, that works well. You can see it skips semitones. This means, by the way, that say I go into high-pass filter mode, maybe let's go for a less harmonically aggressive oscillator, then I could take this, reduce resonance, and tune it as basically kind of like a bass booster or just a sub-oscillator alongside one or both of the oscillators. So in that sense, semitone tuning does help. There's filter tracking, so the filter plays up and down with the keyboard if you like. So those are pretty much the analog components of NORAND Mono. Let's talk about the digital modulators a little bit more in depth. So like I mentioned, almost each knob gets its own LFO or audio rate modulator, and anything but the ADSR knobs get their own envelope. So for example, let's say that I wanted to bring in oscillator 2 gradually. I could assign an envelope just to the level of oscillator 2, kick up the amount, set the attack decay, and we're off to the races. Okay, super simple. The output knob is also up for grabs as a mod destination. So let's say that I wanted to apply a gentle tremolo to it. Just bring up modulation. Maybe not that deep. So we have a gentle tremolo. You've got a few shapes for the X mod. Sine, triangle, a square, ramp or saw for instant dead mouse sidechain, which you can inverse modulate if you like. Then sample and hold. So it's for things like this that a screen would have been nice, because you have to remember the order of the LFO shapes by heart. And sample and hold may not be that evident on level. Let's try it on the filter maybe. So let's reduce the mod depth on level, go back to the filter, and go for sample and hold. And then there's another option, which is noise, like I mentioned earlier, but that only works on the higher rates. So that's, you get to that using the type button. The next type is tempo synced to the sequencer. Then the third type is audio rate modulation, which makes some nice formant vowel-like sounds. Anyway, so a few shapes for that, including noise. So, sine wave, and further craziness can ensue with audio rate mods of the filter cutoff. By the way, in audio rates, the mod rate tracks the keyboard, which is a nice feature for FM of both filter cutoff and the oscillators, though this FM is exponential FM and not through zero. One more thing about the X envelope, aside from applying it to a parameter, so I could make the filter open and close as this craziness goes on, I could also apply this to the mod depth by holding function and pressing these two, in which case this starts to blink. So now we are essentially applying an envelope to the mod depth here. So yeah, you can bring the craziness in and then bring it out. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the analog side. The digital modulation side, let's talk about the sequencer. There are two ways to sequence into NORAND Mono, either step sequence or sequence live. Sequencing live is just a matter of hitting record and play, and you can play notes into a pattern. There's no metronome, so you'd need to obviously play according to time. I could turn on an external drum machine. This is hooked up via MIDI. By the way, NORAND Mono has an undo function. How useful is that? So just hit function and undo, and we can undo those notes and get a second shot. Second shots might be overrated. Anyway, that's how you sequence by recording live into a pattern. The second option is step sequencing. Now, unfortunately, you can't just play a step sequence, a pattern into the sequencer by playing notes. You can either select a note and then choose where you want it to appear, or press a step and choose the note that you want to be played into that step. You can set pattern length, by the way, by holding function and length, and then choosing up to 64 steps, but let's just go for 4 steps here. Let's turn this off. Anyway, that's my pattern 1. If we hit the pattern button, we can choose different patterns. So that's pattern 1. Let's go into pattern 2 and program a different pattern 2. Let's go for this, and it should preview the notes, I think, by the way. That would be nice as well. Anyway, this is our pattern 2. Let's set that to length 4 as well. So that's pattern 2, pattern 1. And we'll talk about project scope in a bit, but I could go ahead now and program a third pattern and yeah, keep going with that. If you can't be bothered to program your own patterns, there are some pretty fun randomization functions. So right now I've got an empty pattern. If you hit randomize, function, tempo, and the bank button, bank A, then you can start inserting up to 4 random notes at a time into the pattern. Let's get a beat going. Now, these notes are inserted based on the scale I'm on. Remember, by the way, that there's an undo, which is really cool. Anyway, so I could go into the scale and choose any number of scales, or even create my own. So let's go for, scale, hold this, and choose, let's say, a blues scale. Anyway, so go ahead and add a few notes. Okay. Now, anyway, so now that you've got your pattern sequenced, there are a few additional options. You can add accents if you wanted. And you can actually also customize what the accent function does. Let's add just a few accents. You could also add slides. Notice how these are a bit brighter. This will show you where you've got notes. So, almost acid. You could randomize this too, by the way. So, function randomize and slides. We'll add random slides. And same goes for accents as well. And let's test the undo. Let's see how far we can go with this. Pretty neat. So undo, I mean, why don't more synths have this? You tell me. Let's see if redo works, by the way. Yeah, multi-level redo. Amazing. Okay, cool stuff. Let's take a look at a few more sequencing options. You can delete notes. You can program ties by holding the first note and last note. So let's say go for this. Okay, with ties. The way you change what the accent does is you hold it and then turn the knob that you want it to impact. So I think if I hit delete an accent, it will undo any accents. So now accent doesn't do anything. And then if I hold the accent knob and say I do want it to open the filter, then it'll do that. That's too much, I can decrease it. But I could also have it, so maybe change the pitch, for example. So you could, or the shape, or FM, bring in oscillator 2. So the accent can be anything you want. There's no way currently, by the way, to change the slide speed. It's just a set slide, and it only works when the sequencer is running, so you can't slide between notes when slide is on. So that's pretty much it for node sequencing. Let's take a look at automation. So you could record automation live. So let's say that I wanted to move the filter cutoff knob. And you can hear the steppiness there. You can actually make the that slide. So slides also make any parameter changes gradual if you want. You could also automate pitch, by the way, which will work within the scale. And then you can also step sequence automation. So if we look at the sequencer, if you hold a note, you can see the parameters that are automated wobble. So I could, I think this is how you delete automation. Let's maybe get rid of it. Cool. So I could say automate an open filter here and a close filter here and another open filter here. That would work nicely. So nice electron style per step automation here. For up to 48 parameters. There are 48 automation lanes here. Now let's turn off the drums here. Another nice function is that you can also sequence mod notes like I mentioned earlier. So remember, mod notes are these presets that are stored in 5 banks of 8 notes. You can go up and down the banks, by the way, using these buttons. Yeah, it's as low as it goes. So yeah, up to 40 different sounds per project, and you can store up to 32 projects on the NORAND Mono. Anyway, so you could sequence these simply by pressing the note and dropping it wherever you want on the sequencer. And let's say go with this. So no drum machine here, all levels are down. We could say go with this. The only limitation is, of course, this is still a mono synth, so only one sound at a time. A few more sequencing options. Let's maybe again go with an empty sequence. I'll just keep this simple so you get an idea of what's going on. So let's maybe go with this pattern. You've got a few interesting functions. You've got ratchet. So if you hold function and a step, you could add up to 16 ratchets to it. Unfortunately, currently there's no visual representation for how many ratchets you added. Let's maybe decrease the K so you could hear this. Okay, so add ratchets. And then there's micro shift. You can shift a note backwards and forwards. There's also swing, by the way. But yeah, it's pretty subtle. But it's there. This doesn't work, by the way, at least as of the current firmware when you're recording. So when you're recording live, notes are quantized to the grid, but you can micro shift them like this. And then there's probability. So let's say choose this note, for example. I could choose to have it, instead of play 100% of the time, have a lower probability of playing. So about 50% when it's in the middle. Let's take a look at one more interesting advanced function. I'll simplify this pattern a bit. So let's say that we've got this pattern, and I wanted to apply a pitch envelope with the X envelope, but selectively, which is what the Unlink function does. So I'll select this parameter, and I could select it without changing the pitch by holding function and selecting the knob. So now this becomes the active parameter which we're modulating, and let's add a pitch envelope to it. Anyway, so that zap now appears on every step, but if I wanted it to be selective, I could unlink the X envelope and have it say only trigger on the first note. So yet another pretty advanced and interesting feature for the X envelope. Okay, so that's sequencing more or less. Let's dive a little bit deeper into randomization because there are a few cool options there. So randomizing notes is fun, but you could also randomize any of these parameters. And the cool thing about this is that you can do that within a range. So this is my pattern. Let's say that I wanted to randomize the filter cutoff. So what you do is you hit randomize, then choose a low range and then a high range for randomization, and then leave the buttons. And you get a randomization of the filter cutoff on a per step basis. Let's do that, say, with something else, maybe with FM. Just go all in on this. Not that noticeable, I think. Maybe if we choose a different frequency for this. Yeah. FM always sounds better with an inharmonic range, or not the same note anyway. You can delete automation, by the way, just by holding delete. Anyway, let's randomize this again. Low range, high range, leave. So depending on your settings can be either subtle or drastic. Pretty cool, I think. And then remember the mod notes, you can also randomize those. So if we go into mod node mode, these are just regular mod nodes based on whatever I have going on here. But you can create entirely new presets just by holding randomize and pressing a mod note, and yeah, it goes crazy. And this happens. So yeah, and it's like your very own bleeps and bloops slot machine. Cool stuff. Anyway, that's mods note randomization, and you get to keep whatever you did, so you can always go back to these. Yeah, and now that we have all of these in place, why not sequence our own glitch sonata? Just put them one after the other, reorganize a bit, and with some reverb. So an instant glitch machine, maybe? Okay, let's zoom out of the pattern level and look at things on a project basis. You can have up to 64 patterns per project. So let's say this is my pattern 1, and this is my pattern 2. You could chain up to 8 patterns. So I could, let's say if I wanted to chain pattern 1 and then pattern 2, oops, I could do that. Yeah, hit that twice. You can repeat a pattern within a chain. So now I've got, that was a chain of this playing once and this playing twice. Now each pattern actually contains a patch. So let's say this pattern, right? If I was to close the filter and bring up resonance, that's pattern 1. If I go to pattern 2, that's going to have the previous patch of pattern 2. I can, let's say, change that to this. That patch will now be saved with a pattern, and then a different patch will play on this pattern. If I wanted the patch to stay consistent across patterns, I could turn them into patchless patterns, which is a little bit of an obscure shortcut, but you just hit pattern and record. Then this starts to blink, and that means that this pattern will not carry a preset along with it. We need to run that on both patterns, make this patchless as well. Notice that this is blinking now on both patterns. So now, if I hit play and say change the filter to this, then move to the second pattern, the preset won't change for as long as this pattern remains patchless. Now, like I mentioned, these up to 64 patterns, so we're in pattern mode. You've got 4 banks of 16 patterns. All of these live in a project. You can either load or save projects. So any changes you make in here stay in memory and won't be saved if you shut off the synth. But if I go ahead and save this, then this will be saved in this project. Saving is seamless, so you can, let's say, play this, and then let's load a different project. Let's go to project 9 and see if this works. So yeah, while the pattern is playing, let's go back to 7. Notice these are patchless, so they carried over the previous preset from the other project, which is pretty cool. Anyway, another thing that gets saved with projects is mod notes. So, for example, in this project, I don't have any mod notes. Let's maybe just create a simple one. And another one. Okay, so these are my 2 mod notes. Before moving projects, I've got to save this. And what did I do wrong? Function. Okay, save. Now I can load up a different project, and that's the mod notes that are associated with this project. Okay, if I go back into my project, then I've got, hopefully, my old mod notes. Yeah, here we go. Back here. So pretty neat. 40 mod notes per project, 32 projects on the synth. Okay, one thing before I talk about the pros and cons. At the end of this video, I'll play out all 32 factory patches and patterns so you can get an idea of what they sound like. With that said, let's talk about the pros and cons of NORAND Mono. On the pros side, yes, it's analog and it sounds good, but there are quite a few good sounding analog synths out there. I think that the big pro that this has going for it is that it stands out with its per knob mod capabilities, the interface with the LEDs on the knobs indicating both value as you change presets and showing you the modulation if you want on a per knob basis. That just doesn't exist in hardware synths that I know of. All those things plus the mod notes per step, as well as the modulation per step and the 48 lanes of automation, can make sounds and patterns that regular analog synths just can't. Beyond that, the randomization features are a pretty nice bit of icing on the cake. The fact that NORAND have been able to pull this off without a screen, not to mention countless layers of undo, and to have all these features also condensed in a relatively tight form factor, all I can say is that if I was a synth manufacturer, I'd be taking notes. So all of those are great pros. What are the cons? Well, first, we need to talk about the price. NORAND Mono is currently priced at 700 euros. Is that expensive or cheap? Compared to Behringer mono synths, for example, it may seem expensive, but remember that the current crop of Behringer synths at about $300 or $400 are indeed analog synths, but they're not digitally controlled. Typically, they can't save any presets, and they don't come close in terms of modulation and sequencing capabilities. When you get into digital control of analog synths, the price starts to go up into the range of NORAND Mono. The only synths that I'm aware of that come close are the Base Station 2 and the Circuit Mono Station, which are very competitively priced compared to this and have some advantages compared to NORAND Mono in terms of either a keyboard or velocity-sensitive pads, respectively, and the fact that they're dual-phonic, which this isn't, at least not yet in the current firmware. Beyond that, they have similar immediately accessible analog sounds, but they don't have as many mod sources as NORAND does, so I think you can get more extreme with the sound design here. Of course, for that to be relevant, you need to want to have 20 LFOs or 16 envelopes and come up with ideas on what to do with them. So that's it as far as price and competition goes. In terms of other cons, let's start with the hardware. The note switches aren't velocity sensitive. You can sequence them with an external keyboard, though currently velocity isn't saved in the sequence. That might be added in a future firmware update, of course. More on the hardware side, there's no noise generator, external input, or pulse width modulation, which is probably why they sent this to me and not to Sonic State. There's no screen. I don't think that's much of a con, except for the settings. Like I mentioned earlier, some things will just require you to look them up in the manual. For example, the play modes or the MIDI clock options. I think it would have been nice if a cheat sheet sticker was provided so that you could either have a quick reference nearby or maybe stick it on the back panel or something. Finally, on the hardware side, there's that slight oscillator pitch wobble that I mentioned earlier, mainly on Oscillator 2. Again, it may be just my unit and it's subtle, you may not even notice it. It depends how much that is of an issue for you, and who knows, it may be addressable in a firmware update. It's certainly not noticeable if you start modulating this with FM or oscillator sync or any of the other modulation options here. Speaking of firmware, moving from the hardware to the software, I have to say that as I tested this synth, I found more than an average number of bugs. Now, every time I found a bug and reported it to Matthew from NORAND, it was fixed within less than a day. So to my knowledge, there aren't bugs anymore, but remember, I don't really do a full QA cycle on instruments. I just report what I find when I explore them, so there may be other issues which I've not found. That said, my brief experience shows these things get fixed very quickly. Other than that, on the firmware side, I think the biggest feature I'd like to see is simple note-by-note sequencing as opposed to the TR-style method currently implemented. An arpeggiator would also be nice, as well as an option to have the filter cutoff knob make smooth frequency changes as opposed to quantized notes like it does today. Also, a fully paraphonic mode would be nice as opposed to being limited to just mod notes with preset intervals as it is today. A few more items on my firmware wishlist. It would be nice if you could temporarily lock the parameter that you're editing with the X mods so that it doesn't change. So let's say that I'm modulating or defining modulations for the filter cutoff, and as I do that, I want to change, say, the level of the oscillators or the frequency of an oscillator. You notice that that then becomes the active mod destination. Then I need to select the filter again to address its modulation. It would be nice if you could just lock it for a bit and then make changes, change other parameters, but always be editing the modulation of whatever you locked. Other things I'd like to see are visual indicators of values for microshift, ratchet, and probability. So currently you can change them, but you don't see what their value is. You have to listen for it. And for the Xmod feature, currently the LFO is free running, whether synced or not. It would be nice to have it triggered every time a note is triggered, or to have that as an option. So to sum it up, like I mentioned, I think NORAND Mono is a synth that anyone designing synths, not to mention playing them, should take a very close look at, if not to own, then as a glimpse of how intuitive things could be. If you're interested in analog synths, the sequencing and modulation features here are top-notch and take things way beyond what you may have been used to with other analog mono synths. All that's left to hope for is that after mono, NORAND will issue a NORAND wavetable or NORAND granular based on the same user interface principles, because this is how things should be done. And if you're interested in ideas on what to do with all these mod sources and destinations, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the subscription bell to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.
Wow.